Well, this story should surprise absolutely no one. Poorest communities fear loss of £2 billion EU funding after Brexit. The UK's poorest regions could lose hundreds of millions of pounds of funding to London and the South East after Brexit, an analysis has found. Communities in charge, a coalition of community leaders and charities, fear the government will not target replacement of EU funding at the replacement required, according to analysis comparing the UK's government spending on economic development to the distribution of the EU's structural funds. Its investigation of Treasury funding reveals significant regional differences between the way in which the EU and the UK allocates funding for economic development. Communities fear that if the new Shared Prosperity Fund, if distributed in the same way the government allocates current spending on the economic affairs, it will be unfairly benefit more prosperous areas. It will be like handing every Londoner a cheque for over £200 and taking £700 away from every Welsh person, says Tony Armstrong, Chief Executive of Locality, one of the organisations running the campaign, which is supported by Power to Change, a lottery-funded organisation for community businesses. Very little is known about how the government plans to replace the EU structural funding, worth about £1.2 billion a year, after Brexit. Secret answer is they don't, because they don't care, and they can't replace it. It is impossible. Because one, you have to get rid of austerity, and you have to implement a massive, really structural and development in businesses, all sorts of areas, to really charge these economies. And we've already gone over a couple of months ago the fact that if the government had done that, we'd be substantially better off. But there you go. The government has pledged to set up a UK Shared Prosperity Fund, but it has yet to publish the details of how much money will be allocated and how it will be distributed. The final decision on the new design is expected after the spending review, which could be delayed beyond autumn because of the Conservative leadership election. Several UK regions are at risk of losing out on public funding from 2021 to 2027 if the government distributes repatriated EU funding in the same pattern as the current economic spending, according to communities in charge. Wales could lose over £2.3 billion over 6 years, while the South West could lose £1 billion, and the analysis compares a regional allocation of EU structural fundings between 2014 and 2020. With the regional allocation of UK economic affairs funding a smaller basket of priorities, including enterprise and economic development, science and technology, employment policies, agricultural, fisheries, forestries and transport between 2012 and 2017. The Welsh Assembly ministers have also called for the government to respect the devolution settlements in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and allowing these countries sovereignty over how the EU funding is spent. The government spokesperson said any proposals which seek to bypass the devolution settlement or take decisions back from funding which has been under Wales control for nearly 20 years are completely unacceptable. The UK's government first floated this idea 2 years ago, but has failed to provide any details on how the £370 million of the EU structural and investment Wales currently receives every year will be replaced. Short answer, they can't, because as we've said before, the EU has been the only organisation which has been responsible for helping fund the poorest communities in our country. And now that gone, like that, gone, and unless we rejoin the EU, it ain't coming back. Paul Davis works for Crown Enterprise, a small charity helping people back to work in North Derbyshire. He says that the Shared Prosperity Fund offers a huge opportunity to address what he describes as crippling levels of bureaucracy attached to the European structural funds. As chair for the local economic programme, Davis has previously helped to distribute 800 million of EU funding in Derbyshire over the past 3 years. For many of us who have worked at the receiving end of the European projects, when we look at the levels of indifferency and the slowness, and the opportunity lies in bringing that back under the UK management. But Davis describes the lack of detail available as worrying, as you can never tell what's going to happen. If we do crash out in disastrous fashion, allocating money to projects like ours would be fairly low down on the survival budget for the government of the day. The government says the replacing funding will be used to deliver growth based on our modern industrial strategy, which is focused on investment in research and development and infrastructure. Akusha Darlington, a steering member of the Communities in Charge campaign and successful organisation of the community buyout of the Stratford Public Hall in Chester, in Greater Manchester, says that the community organisations are concerned that the government will take the easy option and put their money into a large infrastructure projects, not necessarily targeting deprived areas or small projects. Large infrastructure is important, but it needs to be matched for supports for the grassroots, she says. The EU uses GDP per person to allocate structural funding to relatively less developed regions. This, by measure, the UK's is almost an unequal country in the bloc. The most developed region in the UK was West in London, and is over 9 times better off than the least developed region in West Wales and the valleys. The manager of the Wallington Trust says that this is politically imperative for the government to co-design the fund with community groups who work with the people in these least developed regions. The spokesperson for the Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government, so you know this is going to be good, said, "We know the importance of local growth funding to the local places and providing clarity on this in the future. That is why we are engaging with stakeholders to design of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and will consult widely." Of course, still no idea how this funding is going to happen. None of the leadership contenders are talking about it, so you can guess what's going to happen. All these areas who, by the way, overwhelmingly voted to leave, who wanted and said that we are being quote-unquote left behind, we are losing out on all this funding, primarily from the government, because the EU funding was never meant to be a replacement for government funding, it was meant to help subsidise. But you know, that's the crazy world we live in that, you know, the government won't help invest in these poor areas to help bring them up and, you know, be able for them to create more money for the government, which is absolutely ludicrous. But there you go. That's our government, who would rather just cut and cut and cut, and then focus on the areas which are, shall we say, safe seats for them, where they can invest. And there you go. That's the funding situation, and all these areas are going to lose out on their funding. All these areas who are going to lose out on the funding most, all voted to leave. And as of yet, the government has said, well, we don't know how we're going to replace it. I fully expect all this money not to be replaced. And remember, guys, you voted for it, so if you complain that your local charity who relied on EU funding and was doing some really good work basically shuts down, you've got no one to blame but yourselves who voted leave. And I know several charities in Barnsley who are facing that reality.